The Shining, one of the worst books I've ever read. Dreamcatcher. Dreamcatcher's got poop jokes, so it's got to go in the A tier. And then Holly, I I really hope he just only writes Holly Gibney stories for the rest of his life. Easy A tier.
Hey everyone, it's Lucas. I started 11/22/63 earlier this week, and I was thinking before I do any reviews on his books, it'd be kind of a cool idea as somebody that's been reading his stuff off and on for a while now to kind of just go through my experiences reading his books. I've been reading them about 15 years now, so I was probably about 10 or 11 years old when I first started. And I was just thinking, hey, why not just make a tier list of all the Stephen King books I've read? Go through, kind of just do a general tier list ranking of them, and then just have a little discussion on my experiences reading them and just kind of how they impacted my life growing up. Special shout outs before I actually begin. There's a couple books that I've DNF'd that were not really the book's fault, but just kind of me taking a break from them. First off, Misery. I've read about half of it. I've seen the movie before, so I know what happens generally in the story. The book's great. I was really enjoying it. I wasn't as high on the little like novel excerpts that he has from the author's books, but kind of stopped there at the beginning of one of the chapters where there was a long section of that, and I just got sidetracked, read something else. The other one's It. I've read the first 400 pages of it. I've tried reading it twice now, actually. I got 250 pages into it, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. Really enjoying it. Just happened to put the book down. And then I would say about 2 or 3 years ago, I picked it up again, got a little bit further, got about 400 pages into it. And I remember while I was reading, I thought to myself, like, wow, this might be my favorite Stephen King book of all time. And then again, life just kind of sidetracked me. I've seen the miniseries again. I think that's part of the reason that I stopped, is it's just already knowing what happens. I plan to go back to it. I'll probably just reread the book again at that point, because the first few hundred pages of it is phenomenal and I really don't mind reading it. Before we get into Sell, I was also going to share a story of the first Stephen King book that I actually read. So my mom is a massive Stephen King fan, and she had a couple of his books, and I was probably 10 years old at the time. She had a copy of Four Past Midnight, which is a novella collection, and I thought it would be a cool idea to just read one of them because they're fairly short at the time. I wasn't reading big chunkers until a bit later in my life. And so my mom was like, oh, you should try The Library Policeman. Title sounds like a great book for a kid to read. And my mom's read The Library Policeman, but it had been probably at least a decade since she'd read it when I picked it up. And gotta say, maybe the worst Stephen King story that you could have your kid read. Not going to get into spoilers, but we'll just say that there's some graphic content, or implied at least, involving a kid that was about my age at the time. Didn't really bother me that much, but I remember reading it and being like, I don't think my mom understood what book she just recommended that I read. I enjoyed it. It's a good story. But I remember I remember talking with my mom afterwards, and I was like, you do know what story The Library Policeman is, right? And once I kind of reminded her, she was like, felt terrible about it. Hasn't really, I still kind of bring it up just to tease her a little bit every once in a while, but I haven't read any of the other stories from Four Past Midnight. I'd like to read Langoliers because I love the special effects when I was a kid of the film that they did. Anyways, we'll start getting into it. My first Stephen King book that I read is actually Cell, the eminent classic that almost anybody that's read Stephen King recommends at first. I read this again when I was about 10 years old. Cell, written like the late 2000s, about it's kind of a zombie book, kind of similar to like 28 Days Later, where it's not technically zombies, but they're zombies. I'm a massive zombie fan. Zombie's my favorite subgenre of horror. People market got super saturated. People were like, I wish they'd stop making zombie movies. I'm getting tired of it. I was like, no, please keep making them. I love them. Huge Romero fan. Love all that stuff. I've seen almost every zombie movie ever made. Return of the Living Dead's my favorite horror movie of all time. Cell is a good story. I think that Cell, first off, complete boomer plot line. Stephen King, what if using your phone made you a zombie? Like, ooh, really subtle thought, but the beginning of Cell is amazing. Captures the chaos of like the imminent outbreak going on that you don't get in a lot of zombie movies because they don't want to kind of go into the chaos that happens. And Cell, you get that. The problem with Cell is that first off, it's very unsatisfying. Nobody really finishes this story and is like very happy with where it goes. I'll always be a little bit nostalgic for it. I'd say it's a high C. It's a borderline B tier book for me, but I would be lying if I said I remember any of the characters. I don't remember anything. I just remember the beginning. Beginning seems great. You could probably stop 25 pages in or whatever there, but again, it's a good story. Next up, Firestarter. Again, read this probably shortly after that. Firestarter, another book, I'd say, early 80s Stephen King, about a kid and her father on the run from, some sort of government agency. The girl's got pyrokinetic powers. She's got like psychic abilities, escaped from a facility. Pretty general plot line like that. Again, I couldn't really tell you a lot of the stuff that happened in Firestarter. I think it's a great book for somebody my age as opposed to The Library Policeman. It's kind of got like a little bit of a not YA feel, but you got that connection to kid characters, which almost all of his books really have. But Firestarter especially, it's a good story. The villain, I remember the agents and the government were pretty well done. Probably the most memorable thing that I remember about it, but again, fairly insignificant. Don't really remember a lot for it. I don't think it really sticks in my mind as much. I'll put it in the C tier as well, slightly below Cell. Next up, Salem's Lot. Salem's Lot's a classic Stephen King book. Was second book released in the mid-70s. The main thing that I hear people talk about Salem's Lot, there's a couple things. One, very general vampire story, right? It's not like inventing the wheel in any way. Very basic plot line. And again, some people think it's a little bit of a slower start than they would prefer from their books. I think both of them, going back to like the kind of generic plot, there's really not a lot of great horror books that have very basic plot lines that are super popular. I think Stephen King maybe is at the forefront of that as, one of the greatest authors of his generation, of maybe bloating their horror stories out a bit. You watch a horror movie and you're talking like 90-minute movie most of the time, maybe like 100 minutes. If you have a 2-hour horror movie at that point, you probably have a lot of bloat and they're not extremely common. Stephen King, on the other hand, kind of for horror writing is like the guy that writes bloated books. Salem's Lot's not a short book, but I just really enjoy the general setting, like the town of Salem's Lot, getting to know the characters. I think it's just a well done, fairly slow burn. And then when the stuff does happen, nobody's complaining that Salem's Lot's like a slow book. Once the action starts, it's really great. It's got those short chapters where it's introducing all these minor characters and then just showing their experiences with the vampires. Cool cast of characters. It's got like Stephen King has a lot of his horror stories with a little cast of characters going in it. I'm not going to say they're particularly memorable for the most part, but I cared about them. It was enjoyable to read. Again, pretty young when I read Salem's Lot. Actually, the scariest memory that I have of reading a Stephen King book was Salem's Lot. I don't really get scared reading books very often, sometimes watching movies, but I've watched so many horror movies at this point that it is a little desensitized for me. But there's a scene where they're flashing back towards the beginning of Salem's Lot, and I don't even remember what it was, but I remember it like really creeped me out reading it late one night. Salem's Lot classic. I'll put in the A tier. Then the Talisman. The Talisman is a very controversial book, not in like subject matter so much, but just the kind of book it is. It's kind of like a fantasy coming of age, slight horror, but not really a horror book. A lot of people love the Talisman. I mean, it's a Stephen King. Every book you had at least hundreds of thousands of people read them. Even his worst books, there's probably a few people who are like, oh, it's his best book. The Talisman, co-written with Peter Straub, probably in like the early 80s. Read it when I was also probably in like 6th or 7th grade at the time. I remember I had like a mass market paperback copy of it where the cover ripped off of it. So like the title page or the copyright page was showing in front of it. And I was just carrying this book because, again, pretty long, probably the longest Stephen King book that I've read at the time. I think it's a cool story. It's like a cool little travel situation. I remember the book just being extremely confused. I hadn't read The Dark Tower. There's like connections to The Dark Tower vaguely, but I think it's a cool story. I think as a kid, I probably enjoyed it a lot more than I would now. Wolf was a cool character. I always remember him. I remember the main character. I enjoyed reading about him quite a bit. Peter Straub is an author that I would like to get to at some point. I tried reading Shadowland like a year after I read The Talisman. I just couldn't get into it at the time. But he's got a lot of books. Fairly prolific author, was around for a long time. I'd like to get to him as somebody that's really big into horror books and is trying not to just read Stephen King, try to get to the other authors. I'll put The Talisman in the B tier. Probably lower in the B tier, but we'll get there as we get there. Desperation. This is a weird book. They're all weird books. He's a weird guy. But Desperation, big book. Really, I would say kind of like an iconic beginning for me. Falls apart towards the end. I was in middle school when I read this. This is a weird, and it's just such a weird, it's so hard to talk about this book. The characters are interesting, I guess is what I'll say. It's funny reviewing a book that I read 15 years ago, but my wife, so I got my wife, she's really into Stephen King. I'll take the credit for getting into it. And I've only read, I think this is like 19 books. I think she's read like 30 at this point, and tells me to read The Dark Tower, finish it. You'll see. I haven't finished The Dark Tower yet. Tells me to finish it all the time. Desperation is the only book that she's DNF'd. And I think that was just kind of like she got sidetracked, and it's also just a long book. But it's one of those books where if you read the first bit of it and then you see what happens at the end, you're just like, interesting. I tried picking up The Regulators shortly after. Couldn't quite get into it. I'll put it above Firestarter. I'll just say the C tier. Nobody's happy to get a C. I'm not going to say these are like good books, but I don't really regret reading them. D tiers, nobody's happy with the D tier. That's kind of a bad book. But Stephen King, he hasn't written an F tier for me. And then B tier is a solid book. A tier, really good. And then S tiers are just going to be reserved for my favorite books. So we'll start with one of them. The Long Walk, his first book, publisher's Richard Bachman, but he wrote it when he was like 18 years old. I remember reading this, and this was a game changer book for me. Stephen King's really known for horror, but my favorite books by him are all not really horror books. And that's speaking as somebody that horror is their favorite genre. So The Long Walk's just a cool story. That's really like the basic fundamental part of it. It's just really compelling from beginning to end. It's got a really original plot line, which for a dystopian book that's been saturated over like my lifetime, at least, it's kind of a breath of fresh air to go back and read something like that. I haven't read any Richard Bachman books other than The Long Walk. I'd like to read The Running Man. I think Edgar Wright's making a Running Man movie that's supposed to come out next year. I'm pretty excited for that. But the long walk, it's just a great story. I recommend it. It's really got characters that you care for, really original plot line, not long, not bloated. This was before Stephen King figured out he could write a book longer than like 300 pages, which I appreciate a lot. Just a great book all around. S tier. Special shout out. I'll link. First off, there's a guy that is a moderator in the Long Walk subreddit, and the dude is the biggest mega fan of a book I've ever seen in my life. He's got a YouTube channel where he talks about the Long Walk a little bit, and his Reddit profile. He's got a website too where he just some of the most in-depth discussion on a book that I had no idea people had that level of discussion about. I'll link it below. Next up, The Dead Zone. This is going to be another S tier book. Dead Zone, probably, if I had to pick, I would say is my favorite Stephen King book of all time. Again, read this, probably like 13 years ago, probably half my lifetime ago at this point. Kind of like a capstone book, I guess, a bit in my life. It's one of those that I'll just always remember the experience of reading it. Dead Zone's about a guy goes into a coma, wakes up from the coma. He touches people and he can see what their future is and see what's going to come out of them. There's like a little political plot line that Stephen King would go on to reference all the time in the 2016 timeframe. I love the book. I think it's really cool that it's segmented. It's not like a standard throughout novel. There's a through line that runs throughout the plot, but really, the story is told in like 3 or 4 subsections of individual stories where Johnny Smith, the main character, is getting involved in it. I think the romance in this book is one of those, it's like a memory for me that I always remember the romance in the book, and it really kind of like impacting me as a, 13-year-old. But I love The Dead Zone. One of my favorite books of all time. Definitely an S tier book. Next up's Pet Sematary. So we're getting into high school, I think, at this point. I was probably a junior in high school. I took a couple years off from reading Stephen King. Really wasn't reading a lot in high school in the first place. Pet Sematary had high expectations going in because Pet Sematary is probably out of the books I have listed so far. I'd say Salem's Lot's probably the one that people refer to the most as like one of the best Stephen King books. I'd say Pet Sematary is probably like top 3. If not top 5, people's favorite Stephen King book, probably most commonly referred to as his scariest book of all time. I'd agree with that. People talk about Pet Sematary hitting you differently when you have children. I'm not going to try to spoil like what happens, but you can kind of infer if you haven't seen or read the book at this point. I read this in high school. I was not one of the few that had children at this point in my life. I still don't. But Pet Sematary is, while I was reading it, I was a little disappointed with it at the time. And I remember I'd seen the movie at the time, so that kind of spoiled it a little bit for me. But it's one of those books where I look back at reading it and I'm just like, there's so many effective parts that I remember that are just like iconic moments in horror and just Stephen King's bibliography for me. All the stuff with the ghost of his college student is really well done. The scene that's like what compels the rest of the plot line is just like terrible, terrible to read. And then just reading like the inner monologue, which is like gotta be one of the best things that Stephen King does is inner monologue, inner dialogue that's going on when you read a Stephen King book and it starts getting into the italics, you're probably going to see something weird, but also it's really what he's great at. I think it's part of what made him so popular is just the characters that he has and then just getting to know the characters. This has to be like one of the best examples of just watching a person kind of go insane. Judd Crandall, the GOAT. Everybody loves Judd Crandall, even though he's kind of a terrible person. I'll put Pet Sematary in the A tier. I think it probably would have been high B, but I just remember it so fondly. I can't wait to reread it when I have kids. Hopefully get a lot more out of it. Hopefully it doesn't hurt. Dolores Claiborne. So college. I probably was a junior in college, so I wasn't reading a lot in college at all. Probably don't read as much now as I'd like to. But again, it's another story. Dolores Claiborne, 90s Stephen King, narrated by Francis Sturhagen, one of the first audiobooks that I ever listened to. Incredible audiobook. Really good narration. Also just a book that reads well as an audiobook specifically. I think any person that's read Dolores Claiborne would tell you the same thing. But not a lot of people have read this book. It's in that genre or in that generation of Stephen King books where he didn't write a lot of classics. Kind of a downtime once he got clean. Shortly afterwards, he kind of finished, I think, like Wizard and Glass and stuff, but like the mid to late 90s, before and slightly after he got into his little accident. Not as popular books, but Dolores Claiborne's a solid book. I'm not gonna say it like reinvents the wheel again for me. But it's just a good story. Gotta be like Stephen King was in with his poop humor at the time. There's a scene in Dolores Claiborne that I was not expecting, and that's all I really have to say about it. There's a connection to another book that I haven't read yet, but I've seen the movie of, so I know what the connection is. I think it's cool. I think Stephen King gets a little cute with his Easter eggs sometimes. Sometimes I just kind of wish he'd get to the plot of the story instead of trying to connect it with the Dark Tower, which I'm about to get to. But I think this is one of the examples where the connection's kind of neat. And it's not really overdone. And it's also an impactful moment in the climax of the story of Dolores Claiborne. And you don't really have to read the other story to get anything out of it. It's just an interesting little connection that he decided to make. So the Gunslinger, probably again, like senior in college at this point. So what, like 5 years ago, finally got around to reading The Dark Tower. Really, there used to be a blog called The Truth Inside the Lie that is now not here anymore, but dude was a Stephen King mega fan. He had like a ranking of his favorite Stephen King books, huge blog, and he put The Gunslinger as number one, which is weird because a lot of people don't like The Gunslinger. It's a weird book. I've only read the first 3 Dark Tower books, but for a guy who's like arguably one of the most popular authors of our lifetime, pretty much like since the 70s, and he writes a fantasy story, which back in the 80s, fantasy got pretty weird, but there was a lot of traditional fantasy stuff that was going on at the time. These are some of the weirdest books that I've ever read in my life. And The Gunslinger's weird in both the content in some parts, but also just the way that the story's structured and how everything goes. Roland's iconic, interesting. Like you could tell it was kind of written in short stories a little bit. I read the restructured one that he re-edited, which we'll get to with The Stand. Maybe not something that I care for, but in this one I couldn't notice it. I'll put it in the B tier and probably like the low mid B tier. It's a good book. I'd be lying. I read it pretty quickly. It's a short book. I'd be lying if I said that it was like it compelled me to read The Drawing of the Three. I'm glad I did, though. We'll get to that shortly, though. Carrie, his first book. It's weird reading authors' first books because sometimes they aren't great. Carrie isn't great. Carrie's a lot weirder than I was expecting it to be. Carrie's written like the way the story's structured as like, you know, newspaper stories and kind of like epistolary, like, I don't know what the exact term for Carrie would be, but you could tell like it's a good book. I understand, like, I get why it blew up. He got a lot of money for his first book back then, a surprising amount that he would talk about in on-writing. I've seen the movie. Movie was pretty formative. I watched the movie when I was like 8 years old. Great movie. Brian De Palma, great director. Haven't seen the other ones. We'll see what the Mike Flanagan one's like. Hopefully that one's good as well. Or the TV show. It's just not really a lot to talk about Carrie that hasn't already been said at this point. It's just a good story. I'm not particularly fond of it. I don't really see how you would think it's like one of his best books. It's just a little raw, I guess, for me, but I liked it. Probably mid B tier. A lot of these books in the B tier are just, I can't really distinguish between one another. I'm trying to rank them, but they're all in like that solid category for me. Drawing the Three was also about a senior in college. I read it when I was doing some like work that kind of kept me busy at the time, but I just remember really being into this book. Drawing the Three has one of the strongest openings of a Stephen King book that I've ever read. I think the first section, that's like the prologue of the story going into like part one of the book, is maybe my favorite thing that Stephen King's ever written. I think the book slightly falls off in the second part. I think the second part's just a little weird for me. I'd like to reread it at some point to see if that changes. And I think the third part's the weakest part of the book. But this is one of those books that, like, even though it's, you know, starts strong, ends kind of poorly, which is like the old, you know, stereotype against King that isn't really true. I still like it a lot. I would be willing to put it up here. This is one of those books that I just think about all the time. There's just so much stuff in this book that I feel like pushes the boundaries of fantasy in a way that just I find really interesting. He's just such a cool guy. Like, he was definitely on something when he was writing some of these books, but thank goodness he was, because this book's just a pleasure to read. Okay. Then like 30 years after he wrote that, you get into Revival. Revival's kind of a comeback book in a lot of ways. Kind of. 11/22/63 was written pretty shortly before this, but people weren't sure if that would be like his magnum opus kind of thing, how much longer he'd be able to write. A lot of people really like Revival. Some people don't like it as much. I like it. I think it's a good story. It's just a solid book. So you know where it's going already at this point. We'll put it below Carrie. It's coming of age, which is just like classic Stephen King. You get to go through the life of somebody, and then obviously at this point, Stephen King has lived into like being 70 at this point, I think, when he wrote the book, and you just get a really cool perspective. Interesting antagonist, one of his more interesting antagonists in terms of motivation and kind of like the mythos behind the character itself. I thought was really well done, but I think the story for me was a little bit slow. I think the ending's good. I don't think it's, I'm going to say, is like one of the best endings that Stephen King's written, but I thought it was cool. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little bit lost when I was reading it, but solid book. On writing. So on writing. On writing's great because you get the perspective of one of the most popular authors of all time, who is just commonly referred to as a great writer as well. He's not like throw some shade out at, you know, your boy James Patterson, but Stephen King's got his issues, but almost everybody acknowledges that the guy can write, and he's just a phenomenal writer. And on writing's great because you get the autobiography portion of his life, and he lived an interesting life. You get kind of perspective of why he writes kids the way that he does, because he was a kid back in the day when greasers were slicking their hair back and everybody talked to like James Dean, which 11/22/63 right now, you're like, thank goodness he's going back in time, because now these kids are actually talking like they probably should, which you'd write kids in like the 2000s and I'd be like, I don't talk like this at all. But anyways, he's an interesting life, and the dude's been writing prolifically for like 60 years at this point, which is insane. He was like from an extremely early age writing, just really interesting to learn about. And then in the second section of the second half of the story, you kind of get his own like writing handbook and the tools that he kind of uses himself that he gives to other people. And whether you agree with the advice or not, you have to acknowledge that it got him millions of dollars. And it's just really interesting. You kind of get a look in the head of one of the greatest authors of all time. You don't get books like this a lot. And it's not one of my favorite Stephen King books of all time, but it's great. And I highly recommend, if you're an author, giving it a go. Even if you don't like the way that he writes, it's just an interesting perspective that you really don't get with a lot of authors. They're either not willing to put in the work to do it, and they also just don't really want to do it. And the dude's just obsessed with writing. Full Arc, No Stars. So I'm out of college at this point. So this is like 3 years ago. This is like when I actually started updating my Goodreads read dates. So I actually know when I read this. This is the only novella / short story collection that I've read. But I've read short stories from almost all of his collections, except for like If It Bleeds. I don't think I've read anything from that yet. I've read like parts of You Like It Darker. I've read a lot of the classic stories from Night Shift and Skeleton Crew when I was younger. Survivor Type was a big read for me. That was like one of the first Stephen King book stories that I read. And Tastes Like Ladyfingers is like lived in my brain rent free for the last 15 years. Great story. Survivor Type, I'll say that Night Shift, every book I've read, every short story I've read in Night Shift is really solid. There's really not like a lot of weak spots. I haven't finished Night Shift, but I've read most of the stories in Night Shift just randomly throughout my life, pretty much. Skeleton Crew has a lot of weird stuff, a lot of like kind of weak stories, but the best Stephen King short stories I would say that I've read have all been in Skeleton Crew. And then I've read some of like Everything's Eventual, and I think I've read like 1 or 2 from Nightmares and Dreamscapes. Guy's written a lot of short stories, and people don't really talk about him on YouTube, at least. So I'd like to get to him and then maybe do some like mini reviews on him. But anyways, we're talking about Full Dark No Stars. Full Dark No Stars, 1922, Big Driver, Fair Extension, A Good Marriage. This is like a solid. So this is a solid B for me. This is a great example of a collection where I don't think any of the stories are particularly amazing, but I think they're all good and readable. It's one of those books that if you want to read some like just solid short fiction or novellas, these are, about 100, 150 pages each. You really can't go wrong with picking up Full Dark No Stars and just reading any of the stories. 1922, cool little story. I think it's neat. Still need to watch the movie sometime. Big Driver, again, solid kind of like, revenge story. Fair Extension is probably the weakest of the bit, but it's also, I think, the shortest, and it's fun. It's a nice little like monkey's paw curl kind of story. A Good Marriage would be my favorite of the bunch. Again, not groundbreaking, not like, maybe a little like underbaked for me, but that's short, it's novellas. They're not, it's better to have a little underbaked than a little overbaked in Stephen King's case for me. Again, solid collection. Cujo. So get this out of the way. I'm not just going to leave the D section empty. This book is like the one where like people read it and they were like, we need to sit Stephen down and have a talk with him about his life choices that he's making at the time. I believe it can't be a coincidence. My cat's scratching at the door. This can't be a coincidence that he had the intervention like several months after this book was released. I think for a book about a killer dog on rabies doing, all this stuff, and I'd seen the movie before, so I knew what I was getting into. And that's not why I dislike the book. This book, if you are really interested in the cereal industry, if you're really interested in the advertising industry, boy, do I have the book for you. Man, I was reading an article about the new health, RFK, the vendetta against food dye. And I don't know, like, I read that article. It was fine. I also read this book and it felt a lot like those felt very similar. Learning about food dye and, I'm not going to spoil for you what the food dye is involved in the story, but I can tell you it's not extremely compelling. It's written by Stephen King. I'll say that. It's not a terrible book because it can't be, because he can't write a terrible book, but I haven't read Tommyknockers or Dreamcatcher. So maybe I'll talk to you when I read one of his 800-page books that is generally not well regarded. This book's like 400 pages. And it's not often you read like a 400-page book that you're like, ooh, this could be like under 200 pages and I would be way happier. Almost every plot line that doesn't involve the dog just didn't work for me. There's a relationship in this book that is not the relationship between the husband and wife. That is one of the weirdest, like one of the characters in this relationship does something that's just like inexplicable. You're just like, okay, he wrote that. Interesting. Good for him. Yeah, Cujo, it can sit in the D tier. The Shining by Stephen King, in case you didn't know. I think his most popular book on Goodreads at this point. I think like a few hundred years ago, when we're either like cryogenically frozen and revived or dead, people are going to look back and be like, this is like the pinnacle Stephen King. It's like going to be, I think, the one that lives on the longest. And I think part of it is, here, I'll put it, I'd say it's an A tier book. I probably am going to put it at the top of A tier. I think the horror aspects of The Shining are, I'm going to say, a little goofy. There's some stuff with some animals that I thought was just a little silly. Wasn't very effective for me. But you cannot deny that The Shining is one of the best looks at like addiction. Probably the best that I've ever read. You can tell like Stephen King really understands it. You can tell by reading about his life that he really understands it. It's just a great story. Like it just characters, really small, the small iconic cast. It's got a great Stanley Kubrick adaptation that I think they both hold on their own. They're obviously separate works. One of the greatest directors of all time took creative liberties to make his own movie, and it worked out. Some people don't like that. Whatever. They both hold up on their own. Yeah, one of those books where it's like every character to read about is compelling. He has the telekinetic kid that is a staple in his books. That it's like the classic Stephen King trope, right? The like kid that's either like disabled and got like psychic abilities, which in some of his books happens, and it's just a little too weird for me. But in this book, it works out perfectly because it's like an interesting insight into the rest of the plot. Everything's very coherent and works together. The horror is a little bit silly, like I said, but I mean, other than that, this is pretty much a perfect book. This is probably, I would say, the most like complete of his books that I've ever read. I just don't have the special attachment to it that I have to something like The Long Walk or The Dead Zone. Going on, The Wastelands. Wastelands, putting it up in S tier. Wastelands is one of his weirder books. You read The Gunslinger. It's weird. You're like, okay, it's weird. You read The Drawing of Three. Some weird, really weird stuff happens. You're like, okay, what am I reading? This doesn't really make sense. Then you read The Wastelands, and believe it or not, even more weird stuff happens, but all of it's awesome. I think like the difference between, I think The Drawing of Three is the highest highs, like I mentioned earlier, but I think The Wastelands from like beginning to end is just, it's just like an adventure that's just completely riveting. And every section, again, one of those books that's kind of like little sections of stuff happening. I didn't think there was like a single point in The Wastelands where I wasn't compelled and like super interested in what was happening. I think there's some stuff with like our world that I thought was a little like odd. And maybe could have been a little bit shorter, but it's still really interesting to learn the characters. A lot of them come back, great characters. Haven't even mentioned the GOAT, Frank Muller, one of the greatest audiobook narrators of all time. Just absolutely a joy to read. I mean, The Wasteland, I'm not going to spoil it. I'm just glad that I didn't read it when it came out, because while I haven't read Wizard and Glass, I definitely did pick it up, get to the end of the plot arc that was kind of a cliffhanger from the third book, and then I put the book down and said, I'm going to pick this up later. And then 2 years later, I'm still telling you I'll pick this up later. Yeah, Wasteland's a great book. Don't really have much else to say about it. The Stand. This is a great book to finish on. Read this 2 years ago. This book took a while to read because it's massive. I read the uncut version. I'm surprised that this is actually the last book I've read, because it feels like it's been a while since I've read it. So The Stand will just say 3 different parts, about a virus that kills people. The first part's generally regarded by a lot of people as the best part of the book. It's great. And it's also, it's like 400 pages. It feels like its own book, but it doesn't resolve anything that happens. You just kind of watch people die. Part 2 gets into the middle section where it like stalls for a lot of people. And then part 3 gets in the ending that a lot of people dislike the ending. And I think a lot of people look back at The Stand, they're like, great book, but the ending I didn't like. And I read The Stand. I was shocked at how many questionable, not like in terms of content, but just the way that the book is, how many things when I read it that I was like, wow, I can't believe this is like commonly recited as people's favorite book of all time. This is my mom's favorite book of all time. It's the GOAT, Brian Lee Durfee's favorite book of all time. It's so weird. There's so many weird things that happen in this book that I am not going to get into. So many scenes that are 100% questionable, and as far as I understood, were added in the uncut version, that at this point, he had the clout that he told the editor, I am not removing this part from my book. He's definitely got a few of those in his books that you can tell he was like, I'm not taking it out. I really want to read the cut version, because I think this book would be a lot better if it was tightened down a little bit. I don't dislike the ending that much. I actually kind of enjoyed it. I was also really ready for the book to end at that point. I was getting just a little bit tired about 1,300 pages into it. But I think when I finished it, it was like, I'll give it a 4 stars on Goodreads. I would say I would be like, it was like I'd say it's like a B tier book, but I just think about this book it's really stuck with me. I think about it all the time. I think it's just kind of a work of genius. And I think part of it's just like the Stockholm syndrome of being like just held hostage by this book for so long. And there's just so much to think about. For somebody that's a great character writer, I actually think the characters in this book are really, really weak and underbaked, but they're also kind of iconic at the same time. And it's just like the stuff that happens is just, I keep thinking to myself, it's like the thing that keeps me awake at night. I'm just like staring at the ceiling. I'm like, you really did that. Harold Lauder's the GOAT. And yeah, that's all I really have to say. I would say it's up here. It's risen a bit. It's definitely one of the ones that I think about the most, again, looking back at his works. And yeah, that's going to do it. 19 books. I'd like to read. I'd like to finish Misery eventually. I would guess Misery is going to be in like the A tier somewhere. And then I'll finish it at some point and get to understand the magical bond that brings us together a little bit more. So yeah, that's all I really have for this tier list. I am planning, once I finish 11/22/63, I'll release a review of that. Some interesting stuff happening in that book. Obviously expecting to enjoy it because it's a lot of people's favorite Stephen King book. And I'll catch you guys on the next video. See ya.